And we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to No Capes, a PHP series about people who happen to program. My name is Ross Tuck, filling in for Kayla Daniels. Tonight, we have the creator of Laravel, Taylor Otwell, the man, the myth, the legend, but tonight we'll mostly be talking about the man. So, welcome, Taylor.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. So I want to start off kind of at the very, very beginning. We'll be taking questions throughout the program, but you can send those to us with Twitter, IRC, hashtag NoCapes, on Freenode, Passenger Pigeon, email, whatever you can think of. All right, so let's start off at the very, very beginning. Taylor, I'm kind of curious. So how did you begin learning to code?
I took kind of a traditional route through school. I started in high school kind of tinkering with HTML websites and stuff, probably when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And then into college, majoring in IT was very natural because I was into computers and I was in East Lab in high school and I built some websites, so it was a very natural progression. So I got my bachelor's degree in information technology, which actually included more of like a networking hardware emphasis, and I also had just like a few C++ programming courses. But my senior year of college, I interviewed with a company called ABF Freight, and which is a large trucking company here in the U.S. And they have a 6-month training program for all new hires, and so they weren't so concerned necessarily about how much you know about programming right now, because they kind of like to recruit college graduates and then train them intensively for 6 months and then work them into their system. So really that 6-month training period at my first job was where I essentially learned to program. And that was in .NET and also COBOL and classic ASP. So yeah, that was very beneficial. I mean, I got really lucky that I got a job that basically trains you for 6 months like that.
Oh, that's an interesting mix of languages. We actually got a question on Twitter earlier from a guy called Dreaming in Bytes, who wanted to know like if your C# background kind of influences your PHP style and what you code. And I'm also kind of curious, like, did the COBOL or anything else leave a lasting impression, perhaps some deep scars?
The .NET stuff influenced me more at the beginning. So, like in Laravel terms, the templating engine in Laravel is very much inspired by Razor from ASP.NET MVC, and I'm trying to think of anything else. That was the most obvious similarity, but also a big thing. About 4 years ago, this was in 2010 when I first started tinkering, writing Laravel. I wanted a lot of the dependency injection stuff that I had in .NET. I wanted that in PHP. So, like Laravel has always had like dependency injection by default on all your controllers, and they're all resolved out of the IOC container, and that was because that's how it works in ASP.NET MVC with the controller factory. So that the IOC and the templating engine were the most obvious things I brought over from my .NET experience. With COBOL, it's just I mean, that's like legacy to rule all legacies. So yeah, definitely more probably scars than influence on PHP. I worked on programs that were written before I was born for sure, several times.
Wow. That's interesting, though. I mean, like when you're operating on something like that with COBOL, especially. I mean, was there anything that you felt like was a takeaway? Like anything in there that you feel like you actually missed from it, or any good lessons you picked up?
Well, a lot of the code is really well documented because the code is 30 years old, and some of these programs are 25,000, 30,000 lines long, and people leave pretty meticulous documentation on how these systems work, which can be pretty helpful. Also, you really see like the importance of not siloing information in those kinds of situations, like within a corporation, because you can have some people that have been there for 20 or 30 years, and if they're gone or they retire or something happens to them, then you're really in a pickle if you haven't spread some of that knowledge around, business knowledge.
Cool. I can definitely see where that sort of philosophy really applies to open source too, where they can often say it's documentation that makes or breaks a project.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, interesting, by the way, where we're talking about older technologies that you've used. Somebody told me that before you started Laravel and PHP, that you used to do Code Igniter.
Yeah, when I first came to PHP, I mean, the whole reason I came to PHP was while I was working my day job, I had just little ideas I wanted to code out, just little, let's say, startup ideas that I wanted to tinker with. And I knew in college from a friend that PHP was relatively easy just to throw up on a server, and my daughter's here, throw up on a server and get going. So it was what I first tried because hosting .NET on your own is a little more expensive and a little more involved. So I started with I was looking for something like ASP.NET, MVC, and PHP. So I googled PHP web frameworks or whatever, and CodeIgniter was probably one of the first ones I landed on. So that's kind of how I got my start in PHP frameworks, and immediately kind of like started hacking CodeIgniter to try to bring like more dependency injection and different templating engine and stuff, and then eventually just kind of rolled some of that into my own thing.
Interesting. So in a way, like your C sharp experience and some of the things that you missed from it and stuff like that, that like almost immediately began to inform what you wanted in a PHP framework as well.
Yeah, immediately for sure. Like I knew I wanted the dependency injection like from the very bottom of everything. Like I wanted that to be the foundation of how things are loaded and resolved and stuff. So that was definitely something I began working on like from day one.
Interesting. So I guess that really does come back to Dreaming in Bytes question that like a lot of sort of what drove you in Laravel or whatever was sort of your experience. So would you really recommend to a lot of other developers who are might consider themselves like Laravel developers or Joomla developers or Drupal developers or Symfony developers as in framework would you encourage them to go out there and learn other frameworks, other languages, other tools?
I think it can be really helpful. It can, especially if you have languages that are really different, like entirely different, either like strongly typed or versus dynamically typed, or something like that. Something that's quite a bit different. Um, it can definitely inform the way you code your PHP if you have experience in one of those languages. Like, um, because a lot of the architecture stuff that people are into with PHP now, with how they're striving for better architecture and stuff, all that was kind of like, um, that was kind of like standard in a lot of ways in the ASP.NET world for some people. So, and when I and so exploring some of those worlds can kind of get you used to some of those different ideas, and different ecosystems kind of like excel or are less good in certain areas. So like .NET, I felt like was really a little bit ahead at the time. I would say in terms of like design patterns, but it was really struggling with like rapid development from like say more like a Railsy type of ecosystem. And at the same time, maybe Rails was behind on some of the design pattern stuff, but excelled in that area. So each ecosystem kind of has like its points of emphasis, and things you can learn from it.
Interesting. So you would Laravel's positioning is like trying to bridge a gap, or at least find a nice compromise between better architecture, but more of a rad sort of building.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true with the upcoming Laravel 5 release, which I showed at Laracon. I feel like previous versions of Laravel have been more like on the rad side, and I don't want to say Laravel 5 is not, because it definitely has a lot of focus on rad features, but it also tries to kind of bridge the gap a little more in terms of like the default folder structure we're offering people, and kind of encouraging more like interface usage instead of facades and stuff like that. So we're trying to find a nice middle ground. For the interfaces or the contracts are a good example, because you have it's not that hard to make that mental leap from facades to contracts, because it's kind of a one-to-one thing where I can say, oh, I used to use this this queue facade, but now I just need this queue contract that it will automatically be injected in. So it's not that hard to maintain a sense of rapid development while encouraging a little bit better practices.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to talk about Laravel a little bit more later on, but I'm sort of interested in this period, like before you got started with Laravel as well. I mean, so you were working with CodeIgniter a bit, you were sort of bringing these extra features into it, and then that began, I guess, creating the basis for what you wanted out of your own framework.
Yeah.
But there were like 1,001 frameworks in PHP at that time. It was like the thing that everybody was building.
hmm
Um, like, how did you go about sort of marketing that? How did you gain user attention for that?
Basically, documentation was king. So when I first started out at the time, my main, let's just say competitors, even if that's not the right word, but the main, like the closest people in this sphere were CodeIgniter and Kohana and maybe a couple others that were kind of more on the rapid development side of things. CodeIgniter had really good documentation, and probably is the main reason it was so popular. Other frameworks didn't have the documentation that people wanted, and so I knew that even if Laravel 1.0 was technically inferior to another framework, if it had better documentation and a really good community around it, it would succeed. So basically, I didn't release Laravel 1.0 until I had extremely thorough documentation over the whole framework. I didn't even put out a beta or anything. There was no alpha or alpha release with just a few notes or anything like that. It had a finished website with full documentation from day one. And I felt that was very intentional because I felt like, your chance to like grab that mind share, that kind of your slice of people that are interested in what you're doing is it can be very short. So if you put something out on Reddit or something like that and it doesn't gain attention, you're not going to be able to just keep reposting that time and time again because people are going to obviously lose goodwill towards your spamming the forum. So you kind of just have a few shots to make your mark. So that's why I tried to have a really polished documentation set up from day one.
Do you feel like there were any other advantages or techniques that you used that sort of helped Laravel break away from the pack?
At the time, it was it was somewhat unique because the routing was very much like Sinatra or Silex, so that was very easy and it utilized PHP 5.3 closures, which CodeIgniter and some other frameworks weren't doing at the time, just because they were around longer and stuff like that. The second thing was probably the ORM was pretty cool for the time too, because the only other PHP active record project that people were using was okay, baby. The only other active record project people were using was PHP active record, which had kind of become abandonware. So when Laravel came out with Eloquent and have had a pretty nice active record set up, then I think that was a big draw too, because it was quite a bit more advanced than what CodeIgniter's database setup was offering.
Right. So it's interesting to me because it seems like from day one that when you started building the framework that you already had sort of like get some ideas maybe about the market share it would occupy, the documentation, and I don't want to say like the marketing, but how it would be perceived by the community, so to speak.
Right.
So you kind of, it wasn't like this was something that you built like immediately just for your own use and then it sort of took off on its own, but it was something like from day one you knew that you wanted to build a community around.
Yeah. I mean, there was definitely a lot of marketing stuff going through my mind on what's the best way to present it, and I think for some people that makes people uncomfortable, to think about people marketing open source code, and they kind of like it to be more organic like that. But I did not expect it to be as popular as it's gotten, but I thought that if it had good documentation, that it would at least be a fun project that a small group of people might use. So yeah, I just wanted the initial experience of using Laravel to be enjoyable and not be frustrating. And so that was a big part of having such a polished presentation from the beginning.
Right. Well, I mean, and it seems to have paid off. I mean, Laravel has gone on to become, like arguably one of the big frameworks in PHP. I mean, maybe one
Yeah.
of the big three these days, really.
Yeah.
Um, did, how do you feel about that? I mean, it's obviously succeeded like beyond what you'd ever dreamed for at that point. And we were talking about just
Yeah.
before the show started about how you're getting to finally go start working on Laravel full time, which I think is every open source maintainer's dream. You know,
Yeah.
at the same time, I imagine that comes with a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a lot of, I get a lot of emails and a lot of messages on Twitter, and it can be personally overwhelming. And I think I'm just now getting to the point where I'm starting to grasp the best way to deal with a lot of that, because I did not expect that at all. And so you never really know, like, it was hard to anticipate how I would react in certain situations to being in that kind of light where you have a lot of people that adore you, but you have a lot of people who are very critical of you. And that's how anything is. You're going to have your fans, and you're going to have those who are don't really get into what you're building or whatever. It's not their thing. So yeah, it can be tough, especially like, I mean, just on a personal level. Say I'm just like out to dinner or whatever with my wife, and if I see like a critical comment on Twitter that really like bugs me, that can ruin your night if you let it get in your head. So I'm just kind of learning to not take things too personally or too seriously. We're all just building code and trying to build cool things. So I'm trying to kind of learn that as I go, but it's tough.
I imagine so. I mean, like I don't have the near the level of responsibility you do, but I mean, I get that happens. Um, you know, that is something I wanted to ask about. I mean, you're known not just for Laravel, but also for your firm use of Twitter at times.
Yeah.
But it's funny because like I've met you in real life at a couple of Laracons, and like I don't see that guy. I don't see that guy I see on Twitter like once in a while. Is
Yeah.
have I just not met him in person yet, or is it something that like the internet does to people, or is it just like you lose your temper once in a while?
Yeah, I think you just lose your temper online. I mean, it's just, and it can be driven by a lot of things. I mean, maybe I have a headache that day, or maybe I didn't get a lot of sleep or something like that, and the wrong comment on Twitter might make me lose my temper on someone. But I mean, in person, yeah, I mean, people are a lot different. I find, in person, and it's so much easier to talk in person, because there have been people online that I thought were like, this guy's really snotty, and I don't think he would be a very fun person to be around in person. But then you meet them in person, and you hear the way they present their arguments or the way they might critique something, and it's totally different than the way you were hearing it on Twitter. Like, the tone and just the way they act in person is totally different. And so I've had a couple of situations where I met someone in person and I came away thinking they're a lot more pleasant than I thought they would be. And I don't know, Twitter can kind of obscure things that way in terms of how people present themselves and talk to you. But yeah, I've definitely lost my temper a few times, inexcusably. But I'm trying to get better at that.
Fair enough. Actually, it seems like this topic's brought out a couple questions on Twitter real quick. Frank de Jonge, the maintainer of Fly System, he's sort of curious about what the final tipping point was to switch to full-time Laravel development.
It's really just a time thing, and I mean, it's a tough decision because you get to a point where I could keep working part time, and I could keep maintaining Laravel as it is, but you kind of have to weigh that thing of, you get to a point where, to push it to the next level, do you have to go all in, or can you really go much further where you're at? And I thought that, and I think Ian, my boss, pretty much agreed with me. When we discussed it, he thought it would be basically silly to only work on Laravel half the time at this point, instead of pushing it to the next level and working full time. Because I mean, thanks to Laravel Forge, that can support me to work on Laravel, full time, it would be silly to not take advantage of that opportunity, which you might not never have in your life again, because we all know how technology changes. So to take this opportunity to try to really do something, more special and create something even beyond where we're at now. So it was scary. It's scary for sure anytime you go out on your own because at least in the U.S., you have health insurance and things like that to think about, and it's a big deal, but it's going to be interesting. I'm excited to get to work on it full time. I mean, it's hard to imagine since I've worked on it basically in my free time and then every other week now. It's hard to imagine what 40 hours a week every week will let me accomplish. I mean, just in terms of managing pull requests and issues and stuff, that's going to help a lot.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious, by the way, of that 40 hours a week. Like how much of that goes into actual development stuff? Because I can't remember who it was, but somebody once told me that every successful open source project, at least a big one, has a project manager somewhere in the ranks. Is that what it
Mm.
feels like sometimes, or are you still doing mostly active coding?
I do a lot of active coding. I mean, sometimes I do have to kind of like set a vision, so to speak, for what kind of features we want to put out in the future. And just recently, I've brought on a couple people to help manage GitHub issues. So there's a couple people that have full access to the GitHub issues and can respond to and close them and stuff like that. And I kind of let that be their field, and then they sort of escalate issues or pull requests to me that look like, hey, we probably want to take action on this, soon. And that's really helpful because then I don't have to like monitor the issues every night and see is this critical or can this wait or whatever. So that's really nice. And then I kind of focus more on the pull request and the actual like actionable code items that need to be decided.
See, that was something I wanted to ask about, anyways, because often when I look at Laravel, it feels like it's like your brand. Like you do a lot of the communication, you do the blog posts, you do the code, you do like it feels like that you're kind of everywhere and everything at once. But you're saying that
Yeah.
actually there's like a troop of people behind that really help you out and make that possible, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a group of people, especially on the GitHub issue, and then also on the kind of beta testing front. There's a small group of people that use the next release of Laravel, for real, and they're using a lot of the features, and they give me feedback and kind of help shape the direction. And then of course I dog food Laravel on real apps myself, which helps a lot too. But yeah, I mean that's pretty recent. I mean, up until recently, I was the only one doing all of GitHub issues and pull requests and stuff like that. But probably in the last month or two, I've had some other people helping on that stuff.
Nice. I imagine that still takes a lot of time. We got a question from Adam Ingebrigtsen. I hope I got that right. Who wants to know, like, this still seems like an incredible amount of responsibility. Like, how does that affect your personal life?
Um, honestly, it's gotten better. I would say, like as I've learned to kind of separate the two in a way, so that, and I think it's helped a lot more now that I actually have set daytime hours that I work on Laravel. It helps me mentally separate the two, the personal life and my development life, so that when I get off work at 5, I don't feel compelled to come back to Laravel at 10 or 11 that night for a few more hours because I've worked on it all day. And that way, it's a lot easier for me to mentally turn off of Laravel when I get off work, so that if I'm just having dinner with the kids or just hanging out with my wife, I don't really think about Laravel like that anymore because I've kind of turned that switch off when I get off work and it's done. I'm not going to work on it anymore that day. So that's one nice thing about having a set daytime hours I'm working on Laravel now, instead of whereas before, like as soon as I got off work, I might be mentally planning what am I going to do on Laravel after everyone goes to bed, and that's occupying my thoughts, from 5 until 10 or whatever, kind of that mental planning, and that can kind of distract you from what's going on at home.
All right. I imagine that's pretty tough, actually. Uh, did that take I mean, I don't want to pry, but I mean, like, did you get a lot of support at home for doing that, or was that like tough to schedule at times? Was that?
No, I mean, I always did it after my entire family was in bed, so like they were none the wiser how long I was working on Laravel. So I would get off work at 5 and then have dinner and hang out with my wife and kids. And then when my wife went to bed about 9:30 or 10 or 10:30, I would come work on Laravel until maybe like 12:30 or 1, and then get up at like 7:50 and go to work. So you know, it didn't really bother them because it wasn't really cutting into my time with them. And I just had to stay up later.
That still sounds pretty tough, honestly. Like I'm kind of an 8 hours of sleep per night kind of guy, or otherwise I'm dead.
Yeah.
I mean, like, do you feel like that was one of the things that helped maybe separate Laravel from the pack too, though? I mean, the fact that you were giving it that sort of consistent time, that sort of, I mean, frankly, work ethic. I mean, I imagine there were times you just sort of had to power through that.
Yeah, probably so. I mean, I put a lot of time. I put a lot of time into Laravel still, and you know, I don't know. I'm trying to think how to say this without. I don't have a lot of other hobbies, so coding kind of is my hobby, and it's how It's even how I just relax and kind of chill out. As I might hack on something for a little while. So I think that helped a lot too. That at night I really had nothing else to do or nothing else that I wanted to do besides just hack on Laravel for a few hours. So that those hours kind of just accumulated, into quite a bit of work.
I'm just checking for some other questions we have real quick. Um, our friend Yitz, Code Rabbi, he wants to know, speaking of your late hours, no coffee, no booze, just how?
I don't know. I pretty much just drink mainly just drink water. But he's trying to get me. He's trying to corrupt me and get me into a coffee drinker at least. I think.
Uh, I wouldn't do it. I'm no coffee drinker myself. It tastes like cigarette ash to me. We've got another question from Hardik, who would like to know your opinion on an upcoming version after Laravel 5. The big question: Laravel 6 or 7?
Gosh, I didn't even think we were going to do Laravel 5. I was at Laracon EU under the impression that this version of Laravel was going to be Laravel 4.3, and because I didn't think the community would really want a Laravel 5, that they would really want any breaking changes, that they would want to kind of keep things more conservative. But then the feedback I started to get from people was, no, we don't care if a few things break. We want to do Laravel 5. We want to keep moving ahead with some of these changes. And so, it's kind of like whatever you guys want to do, I guess. I guess we can do that. And so that's kind of how we moved to Laravel 5. Was the community consensus toward breaking changes was a little more welcoming than I thought. Surprisingly, I thought they would be very against that. But so yeah, at this point, I don't have any kind of roadmap for Laravel 6 or 7. I'm hoping I can ride on 5 for 2 or 3 years. That'd be nice. We rode 4. 4 is when Laravel 5 comes out. 4 will be a little over a year and a half old, which is not very old. So I'm hoping we can get a couple years out of 5 at least.
Nice. Also, by the way, excellent answer for dodging the obvious PHP 6-7 debate.
Oh yeah, I didn't even get that. I'm slow today.
It's all right. That's an interesting one, because one of the things I wanted to ask as well was, like, do you ever sometimes feel trapped by sort of your code base or sometimes the community about having to support VC for so long? About I really want to go in this technical direction, but I'm not sure I can sell it to my users.
Yeah, and that's why I'm very careful with anything we add, because I know we're going to have to support that for a while, and if it's a mistake, it's going to be a thorn in our side for a long time. So in that way, I try to still keep Laravel light. People's definition of light are pretty subjective, but I think it's still pretty light, and not take on more than we can chew, because we'll have to we have to live with it for a while.
Right.
But with Laravel 5, it's been nice though, because the community has been really supportive of making some changes. Especially with the folder structure, and with more emphasizing the with IOC and dependency injection over facades and middleware, and some concepts that are not they're not necessarily easy concepts to grasp. They're they're more advanced concepts, and they've been pretty welcoming and supportive of that, which I'm thankful for, and it's kind of let us clean up quite a bit of stuff.
I think that's an interesting one too, because I don't want to say that like Laravel users sometimes like have a reputation for perhaps having bad coding habits at times, but there's definitely, like you said, you took on a lot of users from sort of the old Code Igniter space and things like that,
Yeah.
and it's interesting kind of seeing it evolve. Like when we're at Laracon EU, we're talking about the type-ended auto resolution for parameters, sort of that is auto wearing DIC. And I thought it was interesting because it felt like you were trying to provide a path away from facades that was just as easy, still very simple to grasp, but would allow people to write cleaner tests, for example. I mean, is that like something you're deliberately thinking? You mentioned Laravel 5 is really going to be more design pattern happy. Are you like trying to find ways to bridge those concepts a lot more?
Yeah, I try to find ways to, um, you know, try to have our cake and eat it too, to an extent where I can give people a nice alternative that still is pretty easy to grasp. I mean, it's not once you get used to that kind of thing. There are some people who argue that the simpler, more magical code is actually harder to grasp because there's more misdirection in terms of what's going on. Like when you call a facade, it's actually this dynamic method which calls the the IOC container, which then calls that method, and it's a little bit of it's a little squirrely in terms of how that's implemented. But when you have something really simple like you're getting something injected into your class and you're really calling methods on a real instance, in one way that's simpler than using something like facades. And similarly with middleware, that can sound more complicated at first, but like with Laravel 4, we had this concept of filters, and we had before filters, and we had after filters, and we had global before filters and global after filters, and these things could have different method signatures depending on whether it's a before filter and after filter. Whereas if you have middleware, you can do stuff before or after the request, and the signature is always the same no matter what you're doing. So it's a very it kind of unifies all those different types of things we were doing into one concept that you can remember instead of trying to keep all these other things straight in your head. So in that sense, I think it's simpler when you think about it that way, and at the same time, quite a bit more powerful in terms of interoperability and stuff.
Agreed. Is the education aspect like a part of that? I mean, Laravel is a framework; it's a tool first and foremost. But at the same time, I mean, do you see it as playing a role in kind of the continuing modernization of the PHP ecosystem?
I hope so. I think that would be really cool. I mean, it would be awesome to feel like I'm a part of that. And then also, Laravel is extremely lucky to have Jeffrey Way doing Laracast, which is, I mean, he's at the top of that field in terms of video education. He's really doing it just as good as anyone else in this whole programming field. So, and I think he shares a similar vision that I do, where we are trying to, push people along in their professional career. And a lot of people joined us, and even us ourselves were at a different spot 4 years ago than we are today, and we're at a different spot now than we're going to be 4 years in the future. And PHP itself is in that same way. I mean, PHP was so different when Laravel first started. I mean, there was no composer, and people weren't writing these cool packages that seem to come out all the time now. And PHP didn't have a lot of the features it has today. So in the same way that PHP is kind of growing, and I feel like the community is kind of growing in terms of the kind of code we're writing and the quality of code we're writing, I think hopefully Laravel can reflect that same growth. And I think that's true from Laravel 4 to Laravel 5, and hopefully we'll continue to head down that path.
Okay. I want to take a couple of quick questions that are coming in from Twitter that are kind of on that same line. Robin would like to know, where do you see Laravel going in 10 years with this sort of
10?
trend? 10.
10 years? Gosh, I'll consider myself, pretty lucky if I'm still relevant in 10 years. But I don't know. Gosh, that's so hard. I only think about a couple years in the future. But I mean, Years in the future, I hope that I don't know. I mean, I have pretty big dreams that I don't know if I want to get into totally, but I would like to build a desktop app for Laravel Forge. I think that would be cool. I would like to build more supportive tools like that. Um, as far as the framework code base itself, it's so hard to make those kinds of predictions because the way people write applications is always changing and it's always kind of morphing. Like now, a lot of apps are very JavaScript heavy, and their backend is just like a JSON API, and that has changed the way that people structure their Laravel apps, and it's changed the features that are important. Like maybe the Blade templating engine is irrelevant to you because you're writing this big JavaScript app and you're using JavaScript templates and Angular routing and stuff. So the features that are important over time change, and it's hard to predict those kinds of shifts.
All right. Chris is asking, any ideas for making Laravel 5.5 plus in the future?
Yeah, I wanted to go PHP 5.5 with Laravel 4.2 or 4.3, but people kind of shot that down. But I know Symfony is with 3.0, so I think it's possible that Laravel could follow suit. Since we do use Symfony components, we might have to follow suit whenever they do. So that's released in November of next year. So maybe by then I'll know better. But it's very possible that maybe Laravel 5.1 or 5.2 could bump that or something.
Coming back to I'm sorry, we also have a question here on that same trend from Tanil, who wants to know, is Laravel starting to move towards larger apps?
I think it's more suited for larger apps out of the box. Laravel 4.0, you get your default folder structure and it has a models directory, and if you have a large app, that doesn't make any sense. Models directory that's just a weird directory. I don't even know what that means a lot of the time. So that's a very Rails inspired concept, and so with Laravel 5 we want to not impose such a strong folder structure on you. So like in our app folder we just have an HTTP folder and a console folder and then a service provider folder. But service providers in Laravel are almost exactly the same as service providers in Silex for anyone that's not familiar with Laravel. But they bind stuff into the IOC container, basically. And then beyond that, you can structure your app however you want. So if you're going with a very, kind of domain-driven design approach, your folder structure might look a lot different than someone that, just has kind of a simple CRUD-based app. And we don't really impose either structure on you out of the box. You kind of get to make those decisions, depending on your needs. So in that sense, I feel like it is a little bit more intelligent structure out of the box for larger apps, and doesn't really get you in that weird models folder box that was very Rails centric.
Indeed, and I think that's part of this continuing trend, anyways, where developers need to kind of embrace these larger, more standard concepts, anyways, to keep going forward. But moving away from the technical questions for a little bit here, we got a nice double header from Igor, who would like to know, first off, what was he saying? He wants to, first off, thank you for creating the Swift programming language. He's really happy for you, and he's going to let you finish, but Hack is the best language of all time. It doesn't even end with a question mark. Thank you, Igor. Any response?
No, I can't think of a response to that. The Swift programming language.
He also has another question. It kind of relates to something we discussed a little bit earlier, but a different twist. He says that Laravel has gained a lot of popularity in a very short amount of time. Has this affected the way that you interact with the community?
A little bit, just from a time constraint perspective. So when Laravel first came out, I was in the forums every day personally answering questions. And I did that for many months while Laravel was still pretty small. But I can't really do that anymore. I wish I could. Like that would be fun to be in there interacting all the time. But it's just tough, with maintaining pull requests and issues and code and stuff to get in there and do that. So yeah, I'm probably, I'm not in there every day with the community. I am in IRC every day, and I do talk in IRC every day, and people are free to ask me questions in there at any time. But I'm not in the support forums like I used to be. That's the main difference.
At the same time, though, I mean, like with the fact that wearables become more popular, people sort of automatically, I guess, think of you with more authority. Do you feel more responsible for what you say? Do you feel more cautious? Do you feel empowered to make changes in the community that you feel like should be made? I mean, like, has it changed how you interact in that fashion?
Yeah, yeah, I do try to be a little cautious, especially in terms of like laying down any programming law, so to speak. And I try not to really say a lot of very. I don't want to be too opinionated on that kind of stuff. Like in terms of if people are doing hexagonal architecture or DDD or BDD or TDD, I try not to make a lot of like dogmatic statements on that, even if I have dogmatic beliefs, because I feel like because a lot of people will take what I say and run with it, as gospel. I've had that happen a few times where, like, I've mentioned one concept and people just got attached to it, like Laravel users, and then it kind of became like Laravel standard practice to do things a certain way. And I don't want people to think that way. Like I want people to kind of explore a lot of these concepts for themselves and figure out what's best for their application. So I try to be pretty cautious in terms of making, very strong dogmatic statements in terms of programming practice in some areas. Does that make
You
sense?
know,
It sounds a little fuzzy, but
no, no, no. I think that's an excellent point. I mean, honestly, you often see people who become familiar with a particular tool, they get very attached to it, and that becomes the way for them. And then breaking them out
yeah,
of that is difficult. Um, I remember, like, honestly, the first time that we met at Laracon EU, um, I was sitting in a crowd. I didn't know anything about Laravel, and then somebody says, "Taylor's here." And then there's like this whisper, this hush thing, like Taylor's here, Taylor's here, Taylor's here. And then you walk
yeah,
in with a posse, like a scene from Entourage. I mean,
yeah.
like people automatically like they think of you in that regard. I mean,
I know
how do you
that's
feel
that's
about that?
very
That's
strange for
that's a
me.
little weird.
Yeah, that's very strange for me. I mean, like taking pictures with people. I mean, if anyone sees me at PHP World, which is coming up, feel free to come up and talk or get a picture or whatever. But it is strange because that's totally not me. Like in person, I'm very introverted. Like all through high school and college, I was not a popular kid by any means. Growing up, so it's very strange to be in that position. I still feel weird that a lot of times I am in that position, but um, the last thing I want to do is come across like some kind of superstar or something like that, or you know, and that's one thing I regret most about some of the things I've said on Twitter. In a fit of rage, is I don't want I don't want people's perception of me to be, that I am unapproachable or that I'm hard to get along with or whatever, because I don't think that's the case in person. I hope it's not the case, but yeah, it's strange. It's strange to be in that position.
It's I don't think it's isolated to just you in this case, though. I mean, I've seen it happen in other communities as well, and I think on the one hand, maybe it's helpful for short-term growth to have a benevolent dictator for a
Mm.
community, but maybe in the long run, it's perhaps a dead end. That sounds a little harsh, perhaps, but it's not. It sounds harsher than I mean, at least. Um, how do you like if you wanted to prevent that sort of thing in the Laravel community, though, or sort of help people get past that a little bit? I mean, like, what would you recommend for people to do?
If I want to prevent
If
what? If I want
if you feel like you're sort of looked up to in this regard, or it becomes uncomfortable. I mean, like, how would you recommend to your users to say, hey, look, this is what I offer, but maybe you should go beyond. Like, is there a reading list you would like want to ram down their gullet of every Laravel user besides the docs? But I mean, is there some concept you would want to expose them to? Is there, you know, like
Mm.
how would you prevent that from becoming a defining characteristic of the Laravel community?
So I think one way we've started to avoid this in Laravel is we have quite a few people that have become somewhat popular in Laravel. Like for example, we have Sean McCool, who manages Laracon EU, and I don't know if he would agree with this, but I would say he's kind of become like the DDD person in the Laravel community, right? That's the kind of apps he likes to build, and that's what he's interested in. And then you kind of have Jeffrey Way, who is certainly capable of building those kinds of apps, but his focus is more um, on rapid development and cool features that let you do that kind of stuff. But he covers a lot of advanced stuff too. But I feel like people view him as that kind of person. And you know, like I said, I've tried to try to stay back from some of those arguments in kind of an intentional attempt to not assert my presence too much in those areas in people's professional growth in terms of architecture and code structure and practices like that. But it's also kind of a fine line because I have to have some opinion in terms of how to best lay out the framework while not overstepping my bounds so that I'm trying to dictate every aspect of people's app development, which is tough. So, I do kind of, if people ask me in IRC, I try to keep an help them keep like an open mind. Like, here's one book you might want to check out, but here's another article that maybe is a totally different idea, and not be so dogmatic in the way I point people in certain directions.
That's fair. If we have any more questions are coming in real quick. When I was at ZenCon, actually, just something I'm personally curious about, I had a couple discussions with people who were discussing um, is the era of the framework in PHP passing? Like it's becoming more composer, more components, more domain models, more services, more APIs. Do you think that the framework will become slightly less relevant, or is it
No, I really
still?
don't. That's actually like a big disagreement that Phil Sturgeon have had recently, where I don't think it will be. I don't think everyone's going to start gluing things together because um, it sounds bad, but at the end of the day, easy always wins. Easy is always going to win versus hard, and that's why PHP is so popular, is because it's very easy, and that's not an excuse necessarily to make Laravel as dumb as possible or as easy as possible. But I just think that when you have something like PHP that is a natural stopping point for people who are getting into web programming because it is so easy, an easy framework is always going to be a logical stopping point for that person that helps them get started very quickly. So it's very hard for me to imagine. I mean, I haven't really seen that in a lot of other ecosystems. The closest thing would probably be Node, but in most other ecosystems, the framework is still a pretty relevant concept. And for a lot of businesses, I mean, just in a business sense, it doesn't make monetary sense to go that route because you want to have a standard framework that your developers use, and it can let you build apps quickly, especially if you're building apps for a lot of clients, in a relatively short amount of time. So no, I don't see that trend. I don't see the framework becoming irrelevant, and I don't think that's just me being biased. I genuinely believe, like just from a business perspective, it makes sense for frameworks to be around.
It's interesting. You were talking about like how people sort of learn that frameworks are a good starting point for that. When you were
Mm-hmm.
starting off with programming, was there something in particular that gave you a lot of headaches, like something that was a major roadblock for you?
Um, yeah, I mean, at the beginning of my career, interfaces were confusing to me. I remember I went to it. I'd only been programming for maybe I don't know 7 or 8 months, and I went to my workmate's cube, and I was just like, I don't get interfaces. I don't get why we're using interfaces. I don't get what the purpose of interfaces are, or anything like that. So, and that was like that was a big moment in my career. Someone is sitting down on a whiteboard and explaining interfaces to me, and the light bulb went off, and I was like, oh, this is why we need, this is why we need interfaces. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff like that. A lot of object-oriented concepts were confusing at first, especially because I was doing COBOL at the same time, which of course had none of those concepts. So
Yeah, that sounds like an interesting transition back and forth between the two.
yeah, for sure.
At the same time, I also remember when you were talking about that you felt like you actually learned to program on the job for that first 6 months or so there.
hmm
Um, but you'd done a little bit of CS in school and things like that beforehand, right?
You're right.
I mean, what do you feel like the biggest things, like the difference between the stuff that was in university versus the stuff that you had to have in the real world, so to speak?
There were a lot of things. There's a lot of things that you just are only going to come up in the real world. Like for example, we had I was working on a CICS transaction, which is you write them in COBOL, but it's kind of like if you see an old green mainframe terminal and people are keying information in and they hit enter, that fires off what's called a CICS transaction a lot of times. And those transactions have to be really, really fast because you're paying IBM per clock cycle on that CPU mainframe. You're kind of leasing it from IBM a lot of times. It's not, a lot of these companies don't necessarily own that whole mainframe box. So your transactions have to be really fine-tuned and your SQL has to be really fast, or otherwise you're going to have a big bill from IBM. So that was one thing that was kind of eye-opening out of college, was just the monetary implications of your programming can be pretty drastic sometimes. So if you have like a slow query, you might cost a company, several $1,000s in IBM clock cycles, which is never an email you want to get.
Um, just going through some questions. We've discussed some of these before, guys, or folks who are asking in the Google moderator list. Sorry about that. We'll have a video up at the end so you can take a peek. My hat is safe. It is hanging up. I'm at home right now. So let's see. At the end of the day, you've really come very far as a coder. Laravel, as we talked about, become a really big framework in PHP. We've talked about the marketing, the documentation aspects of that have really helped. Do you feel like there's anything else that has really helped it come out? Like maybe something on a personal level, like we mentioned your work ethic before. But do you feel like there's really anything that separates you or what you've done from Joe or Jane coder, just working a day job?
Oh gosh, I don't know. um, you know, I try to have a pretty big attention to detail. So, just like we were talking about earlier, like I spend a lot of time naming things, and sometimes days in terms of naming what the middleware should be out of the box. How should they read? What like verb tense should they be in? And they need to all be consistent, in the same kind of grammar. And a lot of those things I really nitpick a lot because I want things to be really intuitive and consistent. So I spend a lot of time on very small things like that, which I think, people have told me makes a difference in the way, they perceive Laravel and the way they use Laravel, or it feels very natural and expressive and easy to use. You know, Other than that, I was of course very lucky to, which we haven't touched on, when I first started at Userscape in 2012, which Ian, my boss, hired me because he saw Laravel and he wanted to build some stuff in PHP, and he Laravel appealed to him the way he liked to code, and so he emailed me and asked me if I'd like to come on board and help with some of these projects, and that I was pretty flattered, and then of course. It seemed like a good professional move, so I came on board. Well, then he gave me 3 or 4 months to work on Laravel full time. So Laravel 3, like database migrations, a lot of the Eloquent improvements, a lot of that was basically paid for by Userscape and helped Laravel really take a next step in its growth. He helped fund like a website for it and stuff like that. So my employer support was pretty foundational, especially in those early days when Laravel was not, it was not a top in a discussion for like a top 3 framework of PHP. It wasn't even close to that. So that was pretty instrumental having employer support for that project, for basically what was my side project, and really helped add like a level of polish to it that it would have been tough to add just in my free time.
We've got another question coming in here on that note that says, what is your mental model flow to create names for several components of Laravel?
I just try to pick like really natural names, and that's what got me in trouble with facades. Was I picked a natural name in the English sense, in the English dictionary sense, to where it is a facade in that sense, but it's not in the technical sense or in the programming sense, in the Gang of Four design pattern way. And so sometimes that can get you into trouble. But I try to think of how would I describe this in plain English, and I use that as the name. And sometimes I just pick kind of cheesy names like Homestead and things like that, just because it's more fun than calling it Laravel Virtual Machine or something like that. So.
That's an interesting one, and I know it's probably still a bit of a sore topic, but like with facades in particular, we often have these cases where like something that works fine for a particular subset of a problem, becomes exposed to a bigger group of the community, and then there's some, I don't want to say headbutting, but there's some collisions, naming collisions. Do you feel like that has been a helpful process in the end? Do you feel like it could have gone more smoothly?
I think it was. I think it was helpful for me to. It was kind of the first big public outcry, so to speak, in terms of me doing something wrong, and I think I learned a lot from that whole thing in terms of how to relate to people, and how to deal with people at a large scale criticizing your project. And I'm definitely not perfect in that area, but I definitely appreciate the lessons learned through all that, even though it was uncomfortable at the time. And hopefully we'll learn from it in terms of any future mistakes I might make. But
fair enough. I think it's a good attitude to have about it. But on that note, I think we're just about out of time, actually. So is there anything else you'd like to talk about or anything else you'd like to discuss before we wrap up?
No, I just appreciate you having me. It's been fun to talk about some of this stuff.
My pleasure. And if there's anything else in the meantime, we'll love to have you back for a bonus episode, perhaps.
All right.
All right. Thank you very much. We really, really appreciate it. We'll be back in next week already, actually, with a different guest speaker, where we'll talk about sort of what it is to be in the PHP community and how that works. If you have any questions in the meantime, continue sending us to them on the NoCapes hashtag, and we really, really appreciate your time. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great evening.
Bye.